You are listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Isaac Warren. I am the Director of Digital Communications at the Illinois Association of School Boards. And with me today, I've got Sandra Kwasa in our Lombard office, and she's a Director of Training and Development at our association. We're going to be talking about the fifth foundational principle of effective board governance, and that is that the board monitors performance. So, Sandra, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, let's just get started first by defining what monitoring is, because that is the key word here. So could you just walk us through what that means?
Sure. And I think simply stated, monitoring helps the board answer the question, how are we doing? The public is always asking, how is the district doing? So that's what monitoring helps us to really answer that question. Specifically, monitoring is an ongoing, and I'm going to emphasize the word ongoing, process to ensure performance. It promotes accountability, learning, and continuous improvement in school districts. I do want to note that sometimes people believe monitoring is punitive. I remember when I was in school, there were monitors in the hallway, and they were always telling you what you were doing incorrectly. But monitoring in this sense is not in any way about blaming or finding fault, but should always be about continuous improvement.
Yeah, it was really important to stress that ongoing component of this. This isn't a touch and go type of thing. This is going on year round, really. And so
Absolutely.
Yeah, very important there. Can you walk us through why ongoing monitoring is such a central responsibility for a school board?
First of all, it ensures the board expectations are being met. And we'll talk about that a little later, those board expectations. So that's number one, I would say. It also ensures the district is operating legally. It allows the board to ensure its policies are current and clear. And then finally, it provides a formal means for board accountability to who? The community, which in turn builds trust among the board, staff, and community. So that trust factor is something that we're dealing with quite a bit in boards across the United States, not just in Illinois. And we want to build that trust with the community, staff, and other board members. So that's why monitoring is so important.
Sure. It really does show why, again, like we were talking about just previously, why the ongoing part is so important, because you can't hit all of these points in a once a year type of review of like, how's our board doing? Because especially if you're ensuring legal operations, I mean, that definitely has to be ongoing just by itself, and then kind of feeds into all these other ones too. So again, this is a pretty heavy one. How does monitoring connect to the board's role in setting district goals?
Now, this may sound like a complex question, but it really is truly this. Unless the board is clear about what it wants, there is no way to measure progress. In other words, the board must have clearly crafted goals. Sounds like it's more complicated than that, but Isaac, really, that's what it's all about. You can't measure what you don't know.
No, exactly. Yeah. And not only that, it's important that you're able to communicate what these goals are. I mean, we talked previously about that the board needs to communicate with the community pretty regularly. So everyone's kind of got some buy-in on the same page. And if the community wants to raise a question, well, why are we focusing on these points? We've got data to back it up. We've got performance goals that we're looking at and reasons for making these informed decisions.
I do believe also we'll talk a little bit more about some of those data and the use of data in monitoring a little later.
What would you say, what challenges arise then when a board is not clear about what it wants?
One word, confusion. Trust erodes. I've seen staff working very, very hard, yet failed to meet the board's expectation. And I often wonder why, but it's clarity. People trust the clear and mistrust the ambiguous. So there must be clear understanding of expectations between the board and staff. And how can you get it? You kind of alluded to it earlier, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, but those regular check-ins, and we'll talk about what kind of check-ins board members should have with their superintendent in particular or staff. But regular check-ins are necessary to ensure clarity with no surprises. We hear that all the time. Board members don't like to be surprised. Superintendent doesn't like to be surprised as well either. So again, clear expectations.
Yeah. Yeah, and these expectations show how if you're more open as a board and you're willing to have these conversations with your community, you're going to have much better standing with your community and probably have an easier time rallying them behind causes for your school district. I mean, it's probably easier to say, like, we've had this history of doing these great things. We've got a big ask of the community, and they might be more willing to rally up. But if you've got a board who's maybe a little bit more, um, they're shielding a bit more of what they're doing, they're a bit more unclear about what their goals are. I mean, no one's going to rally around an unclear, ambiguous goal like that.
And I guess another way of saying what you said so eloquently was the transparency has to be there.
Yes. Yes. This is all about transparency for sure. And since the board delegates authority to the superintendent to manage the district, it has an obligation to determine whether that delegated authority is being used as intended. That's their key reason. The key purpose of the board is to employ the superintendent. So what does that accountability process look like throughout the year?
Now, this could be answered many ways, but I'm just going to take a stab at a few suggestions for how the process may look. First of all, it is so important that the superintendent check in regularly with the board to inform them of how the district is progressing. And if it is not progressing, why not? I've seen lots of boards or lots of superintendents that send weekly check-ins to their board. So there are, once again, no surprises. So that would be one way, just that weekly communication. And that's pretty common in many boards that I've worked with. And of course, you have your monthly public meetings, which allow the superintendent to communicate not only with the board, but with the community. Again, when you then they need to ask the community to support something, guess what? No surprises. They already know. They've heard from the superintendent. They've heard from the board. The board should also conduct an annual evaluation of the superintendent. Now, many boards conduct informal evaluations 2 to 3 times a year. And this ensures, guess what? No surprises at the annual evaluation. I like to also challenge boards to think about this. Since the board evaluates the superintendent, they should ask themselves regularly, are they helping or hindering the superintendent achieve their goals? And so I kind of challenge boards to have those monthly or those yearly self-evaluations where they ask themselves questions about their role in supporting superintendent as well.
Yeah, that's great. These are really good points because they address a lot of different time scales. Got a couple like weekly check-ins, monthly meetings, annual evaluation. I mean, it's got the broad spectrum here. It kind of got some overlap, which is really nice and the ideal way for it to work.
And I really think at the end of the day, it's that C word that we don't like to say, or sometimes we overlook, but communication. And it's two-way communication throughout the year.
Sure. Yeah. And again, the board is employing the superintendent, and if the superintendent isn't kind of keeping tabs or updating the board about what's going on a regular basis, it kind of feels like, well, what are they doing? What we hired them to do? There's no way to check. There's no accountability.
Exactly. And I think I'm a big proponent of formalizing communication. Not just saying, oh, we'll check in every now and then. No, let's formalize it. Let's make it weekly. Let's make it monthly. Let's put it on the calendar to make sure that everyone is accountable.
Yeah, and I think it goes without saying, I mean, like written communication too. It's one thing to have verbal commitments, but to have it written down on paper, to have an auditable paper trail, I think that's even better it just helps to have like again, it's accountability.
I worked with a superintendent recently and it scares some people, so just beware. But basically, every morning he starts his day on social media, talking to not just the board, but to the community. So he shares like 3 items of interest he thinks the community would want to know every morning. And the amazing thing is the community loves it. They love it because they feel informed. And also, he has had success with that. Now, I don't suggest that for everyone, but for this particular board, it works well.
Yeah, well, that's a really good example. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Very cool commitment from that superintendent. Data literacy is really becoming an increasingly important skill for boards. So should we be expecting our board members to be data experts?
Some of them are data experts, first of all, but no, I don't think it is an expectation. However, I will say the constructive use of data is a skill that board members should learn with guidance from staff, since they use data as the basis for assessment. So many decisions are based on data. So yes, they must have some knowledge. Now, working with the staff oftentimes can help boards understand. And I'll give an example later on of how I saw a board that was a little confused about the data, but the staff was able to help and they really had a wonderful solution. So I think the answer to the question of expert, no, you don't have to be an expert, but you do absolutely want to learn how to use data in your decision making role. I just want to, a lot of times people say data, data, data. Let's all talk about data. But the basic reason for data is data provides proof that will reduce and possibly eliminate board decisions based on incomplete, biased, and personal perception. So it's not just data, it's because we're trying to eliminate our personal perceptions, which we all have when we come into the office, biased and incomplete information. So that's the reason for data.
Yeah, I'm sure that's very relieving for our listeners to hear that they don't need to be data experts, but I think it's a very good follow-up. If you don't have someone who's able to skillfully read this data and understand and get some good analysis out of it, you got to find someone who does, because it's not worthwhile data to have if no one can really understand, like, well, what does this mean? There's no interpretation of it. It's kind of pointless. And boards frequently monitor student learning, but organizational effectiveness is also emphasized in our guidance. So how can boards monitor both areas without feeling completely overwhelmed?
Well, Isaac, first of all, I want to make sure I understand what you understand organizational effectiveness to be. So my best stab at I think of organizational effectiveness as human resources, the financial stability of the district, community engagement, facilities. And those are just a few of the main ones that you see besides the student learning goals. And first of all, I want to just clarify with you, is that what we're talking about when you're talking about organizational effectiveness?
I should say that we are, yeah.
Okay. Well, if we're together on that, I think that the way to monitor these goals is the exact same way as you would monitor student learning goals. What do you do first? You have to develop well-crafted goals that enable the school board to effectively and efficiently monitor the goals. So it's exactly the same. If we have a student learning goal, for example, that says, I want all of our third graders or 80% of our third graders to be reading on grade level. So that's a very specific goal. Same thing with facilities, or same things with financial stability. We want to have a balanced budget at the end of each year. And so that's the goal. And then we began to be able to monitor, are we achieving that goal? Are we falling short? Are we right on target? Or maybe we've even exceeded the goal, and why? And so again, it comes back to defining what your objectives are, what your goals are. Once they're defined, then you can begin to monitor using what? Data.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's perfect. I think that it helps kind of compartmentalize the duties of the board so that they're not feeling like they have to do everything all at once. It's just a bit easier you can piecemeal it, if that makes sense, right?
Sure.
Can you share an example of a district where clear monitoring practices like the ones we've been talking about have led to meaningful improvements in their board and school district?
Sure. I think one of my most exciting work sessions was a few years ago when began to work with a board. And the board did not believe that their students were progressing. In other words, they didn't believe they were learning. They were at grade level. And a lot of their perception came from the school report card. But on the other hand, the superintendent and staff were pleased with the progress students were making. So I found this very interesting because my question is, what's the disconnect? So we scheduled a meeting with the board and key staff to figure it out. And the first question I asked them, surprise, surprise, is your student learning goal up to date and relevant? And they both said yes. So we know we have the right goal that we're trying to measure. We just don't agree that we've achieved it or not. Then I wanted to know what data they were using to prove that their students were or weren't learning. And that's where we began to see the disconnect. The staff immediately noted all the data that they had generated for months. Every month, they were generating tons, reams of paper with lots of information that showed students were progressing. And they were wondering, how come the board wasn't looking at the data? Well, the board was a little dumbfounded because they said, yes, indeed, we do get a lot of reams of paper, but we don't know what it is. We don't know how to interpret it. We don't know what it's saying to us. And it doesn't prove to us because we're looking at our school report card. Now, those of you who are familiar with the school report card knows that that's a snap time. That's a snap in time. I mean, that's just one little segment. What's the word I'm trying to use? In time. It's just a point in time, is what I'm trying to say. It's a point in time. And that point in time, yes, maybe the students were not quite up to the expectations of the board. However, since that point in time, they had put together many measures. They had gotten new materials, and the kids were indeed learning, but the board could not articulate that. And so that's an example of, we had to do something different. And so what they began to say is the board said, well, all we need to know is A, B, C, and D. And then what did the staff say? Oh my gosh, we're giving you A through Z. So it determined what data was needed. Once they determined the data, even more importantly was the format that the data would be presented. Reams of paper, columns, rows, spreadsheets work for some groups, but they don't work for other groups. And so they agreed that they need to see charts, graphs, things that could visually show them and the community that the children indeed were learning. So they changed the format. They decided on the frequency with which that data should be presented to the board and the community and all. And guess what? They were on the same page when we left that meeting.
That's awesome. That's a great story and a really good example of everything we've been talking about. I'm really glad you brought up the change in format and how the data was being delivered to the board. Just the thought of being delivered a ream of paper with raw data on it makes my eyes just glaze over thinking about it, because it's just so like the raw data. That's just not. It's there. It's technical. But if you can't do anything with it, that's just not that helpful. And so I'm glad that this board got to a point where they could just say, we only need it in this format and we only need these couple data points. Sounds like it saved everyone a lot of work, a lot of headache. And in the end, it got a lot more clarity about what these numbers are doing and how their school district's performing, which is excellent.
And relationships, we can't forget relationships, because at that point, there was a little resentment that they were generating all of this work, spending hours and hours and hours. And now, so even the relationship between the board and the staff improved tremendously because they now were on the same page and everybody was happy and getting what they needed.
Yeah, and all it took was a conversation, sitting down, getting everyone together, talking about it, and it sounds like it's just the exponential gains of the synergy of the board that's amazing.
What I have found in general is when boards and staff have these monitoring conversations, they're a little awkward initially because we're speaking different languages. However, when we have that agreement on what's needed and what's being requested, synergy, it's there.
Sure. Well, and just to help promote some of these conversations, could you share some questions that a board member should be asking when monitoring district performance?
Boards basically should be asking board level questions. And when I say board level questions, let me just kind of differentiate two scenarios. A board member can say, how are the third graders doing in our school district? How are the seniors doing in a high school environment? Or they could ask a question, how are the children doing? How are these 2 or 3 children doing in Mrs. Johnson's class? Now, that would be a staff level question. That is not a board level, because the boards are looking at the overall picture of the health of the students. However, experts, staff members, superintendents are hired to look at specific for individual children. So having said that, when you think about board level questions as it results to monitoring, you're thinking of questions like, who are the students we serve? In other words, maybe some of the demographics. What knowledge are they bringing? Where are they? Are they, at a third grade level when they should be at a fifth grade level? Or are they high schoolers who are way beyond high school levels? So those kind of questions. Do we, as a school district, provide a positive learning environment? That's a great question. What targets should we set? How are resources aligned to support our goals? We may have wonderful goals, but if we don't have the financial resources in order to make them happen, then that's a board level question, because the board deals with budget. How do we provide equitable resources? If we have multiple schools, for instance, is this a school A getting the same as school B? Does school A need the same thing as school B? How frequently are students assessed using state or national standards? You've got that one test once a year, or do you have multiple tests throughout the year? How is student progress monitored? Not only for groups of people, but by classroom and by building, for instance. Are our students ready for college? And are our students successful in post-secondary careers and education, which is really what it's all about. So those are board level kinds of questions that board members should see to ask and not get into the specifics, because that's why we hired the expert, the superintendent.
Exactly. And those are fantastic questions the board should be asking themselves. And I'm glad you included that last one was one of my favorites, because it's one that it's a question about their students after they've graduated, because you want to see the results of their education, how they're applying it. You want to make sure that they're going out in the world with the skills they need and that they're doing all right. And if they're not, or there's something that maybe feels like could be improved, you can still tweak it. I mean, that's a really good indication of how your board's performing too. So these are great questions, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and discussing this foundational principle with me. It is a short and sweet one, but it's got a lot of weight behind it. But at the same time, like you said, it's relatively simple when you kind of take a big step back and take a look at the big picture. Well, thank you again for coming on the podcast, Sandra. I really appreciate it, and we will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your platform of choice. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to send us an email at communications@iasb.com. Thank you.